I'd like to warmly welcome you to the first of the Rangeland Journal lecture series in 2011. And my name is Ken Hodgkinson, and I'm a visiting fellow to the Fenner School here. Another hat I wear is that I'm also chairman of the Publications Committee of the Australian Rangeland Society, which of course most of its work is concerned with the Rangeland Journal. The society, the Australian Rangeland Society, runs the Rangeland Journal, and it's also published by CSIRO Publishing. And the Australian Rangeland Society is a small but very active society of about 350 people. You may not know, but this society began here in the ANU campus on a Sunday afternoon in January 1975. I was not there, I was in America on sabbatical leave. And it took place in the geology lecture theatre. And we're very fortunate to have with us today John Milne, who's the newly appointed editor-in-chief of the Rangeland Journal. And John is professor at the University of Aberdeen. So this is a big change for us to have somebody from Scotland, where you think there are no rangelands, but in fact there are quite a few. It depends on what your definition of rangelands is. And the other person I'd like to introduce is Chris Anderson from CSIRO Publishing. Chris? Now, I wanted to particularly point these people out to you because afterwards you'll be most welcome to go and talk to them about the journal or about publishing in general. And also at the end of the seminar, I'd invite you to stay for about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, for a short Q&A involving these two, John and Chris. There are 3 other lectures in this series. Next Tuesday, there'll be one in Alice Springs, and Friday week, there's one in Brisbane, and lastly, Monday fortnight, there's one up in Townsville. And all 4 lectures are being videoed and will be available for viewing on the Society's website. And the Society is very grateful to Professor Steve Dovers for making this venue available for this lecture. And also I'd like to particularly thank David Salt and Edwina Wright for organising the video today. Our speaker today, Mark Stafford Smith, is I'm sure known to many of you. Mark did his PhD work here at the ANU, not far from where we are now, I understand. He lived for many years in Alice Springs, but now lives in Canberra. And his contribution to rangeland science has been immense and still continues. A few years ago, Mark was Chief Executive Officer of the Desert Knowledge Cooperative Research Centre in Alice Springs. He began that CRC. And his current role is as Science Director of CSIRO's Climate Adaptation National Research Flagship. And Mark is also an Associate Editor of the Rangeland Journal. And Mark's topic today is Sustaining the Outback, from rangelands ecology to a science of desert living. Will you please welcome Mark?
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. Now, Ken's voice, having been practiced across the barring of many sheep, you can sort of hear echoing right around the room. But in fact, we're recording all of this, so we're on a microphone, so hopefully you'll cope happily with that. And as Ken said, thanks for the introduction, and I was very involved in the Desert Knowledge CRC, which is finished now, and much of what I'm going to talk about is sort of a legacy from that, but I'm trying to repaint some of that in its relevance both today and perhaps particularly a little bit to the issue of where a journal like the Rangeland Journal might go and how and what sort of science might underpin it and why that might be important for the world, really. And so I put this slide up. It'll be the only one that really formally has the Desert Knowledge CRC logo on it, because that's all finished and it's moved on to another CRC called the CRC for Remote Economic Participation, which has taken up the banner of many of the same issues, but as a different sort of framing of things. So I would like just to relate this a little bit to where the journal's going, because I think that's really important, and I hope those of you who haven't had anything to do with this might think about publishing in it. And in terms of thinking about the way in which rangelands research has changed over the past 2 or 3 decades, I thought I'd sort of illustrate it by picking up this edition of the journal, which is the first one on my shelves, because I didn't join the society until 1984. So one from 1984, and you can see a nice enough cover, but not quite as dynamic as you might have today. And the topics in the journal had to do with sheep diets and distributions of animals, grass defoliation. That could have been a paper by Ken himself, although this particular one wasn't, and around things like water point management. And in fact, the sheep diet stuff was from John Taylor, who some of you all know, and it had a lot to do with the distribution of sheep shit on top of hills in the northern tablelands of New South Wales, which is always of interest to me because quite a bit of my PhD, which I'd just finished, involved mapping sheep shit across large paddocks in South Australia. So anyway, that was the nature of the research that was appearing in the journal at that time, very much aimed at rangelands ecology perhaps, but, and management, but very much aimed at the production side of it. Now here's one which I picked fairly much at random from last year, much more recent. And really the change, apart from the change in colour and cover and photos and things like that, which John I'm sure is going to maintain, the change in it is sort of summarised by the topic, which you won't be able to read, but has these words in it: the dynamics of people, land and water. It's a much more integrated view on how these landscapes are operating. And if you look through the papers, which you also can't read here, you'll find there's things about Indigenous knowledge, about the governance systems for regional things in the area. There's still some, a ground cover-based incentive approach. So I mean, there's still some things about the detailed ecology and so on. But an awful lot of it is getting into the much greater diversity of uses that there are out on these landscapes. And really, that sets the theme for what I want to talk about. And so we see this sort of changing conceptualisation of rangelands from essentially a grazing resource through to much more of a multifunctional landscape, the sort of thing that John Holmes, the geographer, talks about in these areas, and a source of livelihoods for a whole diverse range of people. And with this goes a real need for a changing type of theory that we might base our work on. Because if you're looking back to those days of managing plants and animals for pastoral production, the rangelands ecology, which had a really lustrous history of producing some interesting new ecological concepts, things like multiple stable states and disequilibrium ecology and so on. Important as all of that was, we need to move on and encompass a whole stack of other aspects to do with all these other uses and the ways that those things play out in people's lives and livelihoods. And the CRC, I think, contributed to trying to develop some of this under the rubric of science of desert living, and I'll use that today, but I mean, it doesn't really matter what you title it under. It's trying to think about what are the elements of a much broader suite of conceptual approaches and theory, if you like, which can underpin practice of policy and management in these areas. Could perhaps, John, underpin some of the focus of the journal's future, and in fact, I shall argue, have much wider implications for the world at large. So, let me launch into this. I want to start by just talking a little bit about the sort of features of rangelands or dry lands. I'll use that a bit interchangeably, but of course they're not quite the same in strict definitions. We can talk about that if you want to. But we're talking about 40% of the world's land surface, home to a couple of billion people, so quite a large number of people. And a lot of those people with livelihoods that are based on natural resources and potentially quite at risk of things like climate change and other land degradation, things like that. Very large chunk of Australia, of course, we all know that in a general sense. So it's a big bit of the world. And when you look across those regions, perhaps epitomised in the most extreme here in Australia, but by and large, those regions have got these sorts of characteristics. They have a relatively variable and unpredictable climate, and it's not necessarily just rainfall in that. It can be things like the Zuds in Mongolia, the extreme cold events that have the same sort of uncertainty about them. In a broad sense, it's low production, but within that low production, there are patches, rich patches. In the ecological sense, it's things like oases and floodplains and so on. But in a broader human habitation sense, there are other things too, mines and tourist attractions and things like that, which are hotspots of activity. It's the relatively low production and uncertainty about it all. It tends to mean that they've got relatively sparse populations. Here in Australia, we're at one real extreme of that, which is sort of comparable to one or two places like Mongolia and perhaps Patagonia, places like that. But in many other drylands, the populations may be denser than here, but they're still relatively sparse compared to the surrounding wetter areas. And as a result of that, you end up with these areas being relatively remote, and that means they're potentially a long way from centres of power, from markets, from the centres of learning, from companies and all sorts of other things. They have a distant voice, as we say on this. And all of this, we've argued, is a bit of a syndrome. So any individual ones of those, as this cartoon doesn't really illustrate, but might do, you can find many of those things in other places. You can find them in desert islands and things. But the combination of them, the combination of all of those things together, is something which is really characteristic of particularly the more extreme dryland regions like here in Australia, the least likely settled ones. And if you take that as being a set of characteristics which characterise these environments, then it sort of leads you to try and think about, I think, about how the system operates in a slightly different way. Because really, if you take, just to summarise them very briefly, as sort of variability, low productivity, sparse population, remoteness or remote markets and other things, and this distant voice issue, there's a whole, if you go into Desert Australia or other drylands and try and study ecology or try and study service delivery or try and study health, any of those things in both disciplines or sectors in terms of those run into these issues. And you can go and talk to engineers who are trying to put in remote area power supplies into Aboriginal communities, and they'll tell you that they run into these sorts of issues all the time. And if you go and talk to any of these other boxes there, people will say that the way that they try and do whatever their particular discipline or sector is affected by these things. And that just leads you, I think, in a scientific sense to ask, well, can't we reorient ourselves and actually be thinking about what are the general principles that have to do with these characteristics which operate across all of these different areas, and can we draw out some general principles, some ideas which actually we can have some general theory about, which informs all of these things rather than every sector having to relearn from scratch in its own context. And that really is what I think this Science of Desert Living is trying to do. Think about whether there is a coherent science about living in environments that have got these characteristics, which informs all of these different sectors and disciplines. So let me try and tackle some of the approaches that we have talked about in relation to this, and come back to the bit that's sort of where I've evolved from, which comes from the ecology of it all. And let me talk a bit about the sort of strategies that our biota in Desert Australia and other drylands around the world has the sort of strategies that has evolved to cope with these, particularly this issue of being variable and also having relatively poor access to resources. And it's possible to lay out these strategies, and I'd love to give a whole talk on these, which I'm not going to do, they're only on this one slide. But just to highlight that it is possible to identify some quite well-defined strategies that have each got their well-definable rationale as to why they deal with different aspects of these characteristics. So you can be, your mulga woodlands that have basically sit there and persist through poor times, through the climate variability. You can be things that live in refuges, things that live up in the sort of wet pockets in the ranges west of Alice Springs, for example. You can be ephemerals, the classic desert thing of popping up and then vanishing and hiding away while things are poor. You can be nomadic, so you can start moving in space, at least you can if you're an animal rather than a plant. And you can move to different places where the resources are currently happening. And you can be this slightly pejorative term of exploiter. You can be someone who basically lives outside this area and hops in from time to time and knocks off resources when they're good, but goes away when they're not. So those are all strategies that individual species can take. There are a number of other strategies which have got to do with species interacting, so facilitation. It's actually very common in drylands. There's a growing literature on this, to find one organism facilitated by another. Grasses growing under the shade of actually the protection of a tree canopy that doesn't give a direct doesn't provide any resources directly to that other organism, but just actually provides a different microclimate that they can do better in. A whole suite of other things, the classic, all the things that are facilitated by a big river red gum, for example. And then at a larger scale, again, the sort of self-organising communities, again, the classic, the mulga groving that people may know about, the very strongly patterned landscapes that you get, but all sorts of other patterns that you can find as well, which are above the individual species, in fact, in the many species sort of level. So these are different strategies for dealing with things, and the important thing about them, in my mind, is that, I should say, and of course there are some combinations, and you can find some more complexities than is illustrated there, but pulling these out leads to some really interesting messages. Because, and I think the single most interesting one to my mind is this, there are lots really, but one of the most interesting is that you can start to look at, for each of those strategies, what are the weak points in that strategy? What's the thing which, if you upset, stuffs up that strategy and means that you risk losing that organism that's trying to use that strategy? For the long-lived perennials that persist through dry times, the critical thing is actually the work that Ken's done on perennial grasses, looking at the gradual knocking off of the stored resources, which might mean that they don't regain that enough during good times to be able to cope through the next dry time. That's the key weak point of that strategy. There's a couple of others. If you're a species that depends on a particular niche, like that wet pocket in a range, well, if you mess up the hydrology of that spot, that means that's no longer there, then you lose that resource. So you undermine that strategy. And you can work through each of those strategies I had on the previous page and identify what the sort of weak points are. Some of them which are very local, some of them which are more about large-scale spatial processes. So, for example, with the nomads that move around the landscape, picking up different pulses of productivity in different parts of the continent, if you degrade that pulse network, if you actually remove some of the wetlands that actually provide some of those pulses for some species and get them so far apart that species can't move between them, or they become synchronized so they all dry out at the same time or something like that, then that's a weak point in that strategy. So you can start to identify what these are, and then you can think about managing to avoid those, of course. And that's a really important thing. And so, I mean, that leads to some straightforward implications for natural resource management, which I'll just touch on to illustrate that these things have practical implications. So when you take those weak points and look, as we did a few years ago, at a whole series of pastoral grazing best practice manuals from different regions. I wouldn't claim that every pastoralist follows this, but most of those best practice manuals from the last couple of decades at least actually deal with pretty much all of these weak points. It's actually quite impressive when you go and look at them. People have worked them out, they don't put them in those terms, but they're all more or less dealt with. And so really, given that we understand this, there is no excuse for producing a new pastoral best practice manual which doesn't handle every single one as appropriate for the environment that you're in. So, I mean, that's quite a positive thing. Again, there's another step to actually have everyone take notice of them, but nonetheless, at least we have the understanding. At the same time, we went and looked at conservation management guides and plans from parks and things like that from desert areas, and it's actually very hard to find the equivalent best practice principles anywhere. There's a few that are embedded in plans in very implicit ways, but really, these are really needed in the same way that David Lindenmayer here has articulated those for wetter forests. And if you look at a whole stack of other other resource uses in rangelands, it's extremely hard to find any sign of those things being reflected. And so there's a really simple, straightforward implication from thinking about these things, that we need to think about how each of those plays out in these different industries. And as we develop new resource uses, new bush foods or whatever, we need to think quite explicitly about doing it in those. All right, well, that leads to some theory, I think. It leads to some research questions that need to be addressed, some of which have been a bit. So you can think about what they might be. What are these weak points? Can we actually really test them properly and make sure that they're true? Can they be generalised? Can they be applied to other industries? But also then, how can these sorts of response strategies, if they are sort of universal, well, are they universal responses to these sorts of drivers, this variability and so on? And if so, how can they be used in other settlements, in other sectors, in other uses? So how can we actually draw them down, that diagram that I had up earlier on, and say, well, these principles actually apply in all these other sectors too, and you don't need to go and learn from scratch what the strategies are. You can actually take this as a general set of principles. And we can think about them in terms of settlement structures and service delivery and so on, and get away from the idea that cities are the technology that keeps the rest of the world going, to actually ask how does this happen out in these regions by themselves. And let me go on and have a bit of a think about that. So to move on to the settlement side, here's the settlement pattern of desert Australia. This is always an amazing picture to me because it's just so different to, if you pull up a map of France or something like that, it is just so different to a rural pattern of settlement anywhere else. So you have a handful of larger settlements, which in this case are showing, the red bit showing the proportion of indigenous as opposed to non-indigenous people in them. And then this huge scattering of about 860 or so indigenous communities with a population of less, well, mostly indigenous communities with a population of less than a couple of hundred people. But in fact, an incredibly sparse settlement pattern at that sort of scale. So it's a really interesting one anyway. But what sort of implications does all of this thinking have for that? Well, I just want to introduce this idea of a community of livelihood. So really, when you look at what people living out in those settlements do, most of them get their material livelihood from one of these 6 sources. And I won't spend time going through these in detail. I just want you to get to accept the idea that there are a limited number of types of resources, a limited number of types of livelihoods. They may be based on the natural resources, some of the physical resources like mining. They may be based on some of the cultural resources and social capital, and that's actually not normally recognised as one, but it's quite significant. Clearly, some people live on welfare, and then there's a set of people who really live there by servicing the people who are there for these other reasons, either in the public interest or more as small business and so on. And when you think about it, all of these, pretty much all of these, perhaps at least the cultural resources, have got the same variability behind them, variability on different timeframes perhaps, but they all have to deal with variability in the same sort of way as a pastoral property does, but just perhaps with different flavours of it, but high variability nonetheless. And so that implies that these communities that are based on these things must actually have to try and, well, at least potentially might be trying to deal with the same sorts of strategies that we've seen for the plants. And in fact, when you go and look at some of these communities, you know, they really are quite peculiar when you think about them in terms of coastal settlements and so on. So Lee Creek, you know, back in 1980, the mining company discovered coal under the main street, and so they just upped it and moved it. I mean, that's not something you normally do with central Sydney or anything like that. And they just moved it about 30 kilometres and rebuilt it. Yulara, it's a refuge, clearly. It is just completely focused on the value of tourism at Ayers Rock. If that wasn't there, there might be a couple of shacks there, that's all. So it's one of these refuging strategies. It's absolutely dependent on a little pocket of rich resources, in this case, tourism attraction. Tea Tree, dependent on, it's another peculiar sort of settlement pattern with a few little pockets of irrigated horticulture and regional governance, very focused on that, and again, a bit dependent on the persistence of that water supply. Murchison hasn't even got a township. It's just a scattering of individual properties. So it's if you like, it's the spread out roots of a perennial plant absorbing resources in a very very diffuse way from a very low production landscape. There's the central parks in Central Australia, which is a bit similar, in fact, but based around different sorts of resources of conservation and tourism. Although there's Alice Springs there, if you get outside that, it's very much just a bit like Murchison Shire, no particular town centre. And then there's Aboriginal communities like Engawalla, where you know the entire turnover in the town is pretty much poured through the equivalent of what goes through the store. And in the space of 6 months of study that some people were doing here in the CRC, the population varied between two people and 400. Now, you know, you do the same to Sydney, and that's varying from 20,000 people to like 20 million. And I mean, how would you design a service delivery system to actually manage that? It's just peculiar when you think about it. So all of these really, the point about these is that these are not ways of functioning that will readily come to the minds of people who are designing systems, governance systems, service delivery systems or whatever, for areas which are well populated and don't actually have these types of extremes. Having said that, I will say, you know, some interesting things about some coastal settlements outside towns that have some of these characteristics which could probably learn from this. So this has some implications. So if most of these smaller settlements are actually focused on, by and large, one of these communities of livelihoods. They tend to be, the very smaller ones, tend to be either mining towns or tourism towns or whatever. And it has a real implication for the nature of service demand, which is quite different in these areas. So if you go to a city, you've got perhaps 1 million or 2 million people, and whatever this access is of aspirations for different sorts of services, there's a huge diversity of them, and part of the role of city governance is to try and resolve that diversity and deliver to something which broadly satisfies the majority and maybe has some special cases for a few other communities. By comparison, these remote communities have a very narrow set of, probably much narrower than this suggests, a narrow set of aspirations and needs related to their particular community of livelihoods. And they're very unlikely to be sitting anywhere near the sort of typical norms that a city manager might think about trying to deliver. And so when you try and deliver to those communities the same standards of service that you might expect in Tuareg or somewhere, it's almost certainly not going to hit the right spot anyway, and also the systems that you have to deliver it are almost certainly going to be completely out of kilter with what you need. And just to chuck up a couple of graphs just to show that this isn't me just arm waving, this really is the nature of these communities. I'm just going to show you actually 4 quick pictures where this axis here is the population of a series of different statistical units going from areas which have just got a population very low down into the hundreds up to 30,000, which is probably Alice Springs. And this axis up here, in this case, is showing a thing called the Industry Diversity Index, which is some measure of the diversity of the different livelihoods that are happening there. And so you can see my point that these smaller communities, the vast majority of the ones out there, have got very low diversity. They're all pretty much monocultures of particular industries, possibly a couple of things in there. In the same sort of way, on the left here, we've got the median age. And you can see that as you get to the slightly bigger ones, there's a reasonably consistent 30 to 40 years of age is the median. But when you get down to these small ones, there are some which are very old, some which are much younger. They're much more diverse in terms of their nature. Same applies here to the percentage of people who are qualified. I can't remember exactly what that means, but again, in these bigger communities, somewhere around the 30 to 40%. But in the small ones, it can be anything from 0 to 70%. And lastly, here's the proportion of Aboriginal people in different communities. So again, in the bigger ones, eventually settle down at around 10-15%. But in these small ones, you get anything from 0 to basically 100% Aboriginal people and all the things in between. So you really do have communities, these smaller ones, which are very, very narrowly focused in terms of the diversity of things that they're doing. So that means they're likely to have narrow and different aspirations for services to the mainstream. And it also means that you can start to think about these communities in terms of those strategies that I was talking about before. The ones which are these diffuse, low activity, the sort of Murchison-Shire thing where you're really persisting through dry times by having just a low, steady amount of activity out there all the time. They're the ones that will be easily disrupted if you stuff up their reserves. And there's all sorts of ways you can do that, and we could talk about drought policy and things like that. Ones like Yalara that are based around particular niches, you destroy the value of that niche and the thing's gone. So, and you can think those through for each of these things. So all of this has implications for the pernicious idea of settlement viability and what that might mean when you manage to make it a bit more sophisticated than the view you might get from Sydney. Well, so that's trying to illustrate that some of these ideas can flow through, at least could flow through. I think there's a lot more work to do to prove that those things do, but could flow through into a whole stack of things to do with settlements and services. I've just got one slide, but I want to talk for a moment about the nature of healthy and dysfunctional economies at a larger scale. And this is going to be pretty simplistic, but I want to come back to it in a slide near the end of the talk. And it's just to say that in a sort of healthy settlement or regional economy, ideally you would have inputs of people and skills and dollars coming in. They would cycle around inside the community a fair bit, get used several times and have good multipliers there. And they'd produce some outputs which go out into the outside world, and probably there should be a feedback loop there that comes. And a little bit of it might leak out of that region or out of the basic economy of that region. That's not how most of our desert communities are operating though, especially the smaller ones. They're looking more like this, where there's a stack of inputs that come in, they hardly stay in the community at all, very modest amounts of output, and most of it leaks straight back to administrators who actually live in town, or tourist companies that, or indeed airlines where people pay for things, but actually it all goes back to the major cities. And so thinking about whether these can be modified and modulated and how this relates to those strategies is an important thing at a larger scale. And I'm going to just come back and touch on that in a minute. But behind all of this, then, one might hope that you could start to construct this idea of a science of desert living, which would have, I think, at least these three elements to it. It would synthesize some of the existing sectoral and disciplinary work, actively looking for some of these parallels related to the desert drivers that sit across them all. It would think then about, for those desert drivers, what are the sort of integrated, more underpinning theory that can play out across these sectors and purposes in some sort of universal way. And it would also think about the methodologies that might be particularly appropriate for that. And for those who've been to Alice Springs, I just put in Casa Nostra's here because most important thinking in Alice Springs happens in that cafe. And so my contribution to this, I guess, in part of this project with the CRC was to try and think about this as a desert system. So how do those things flow through to a sort of systems view on how the desert as a whole operates? And in essence, it's this, that there's some drivers, which we've already talked about, which are in the biophysical domain, which result in a sparse population out there, sparse and patchy, and in fact quite often mobile. There's other features in there that are important. You've got a sparse population. By definition, it's a long way from everyone else, so it's remote. It's remote from markets and business and political centres, and from things like the mental models, which are constructed by the majority of people managing things. There are some other features, which I won't touch on much now, but things to do with local knowledge and cultural differences, which are also significant in this. But together, that flows through to create another layer of what I call social uncertainty, but is intended just to encompass a whole stack of other aspects of uncertainty which come from the social system. And that's things like unpredictability in distant markets, lack of control over sort of policy intervention, things like the intervention that pops in without much input from local people, but also things which are internally social, so the effect of losing one person from a small community being much bigger than it is from a large one. Those in turn then so that adds another layer of uncertainty to some of the variability that comes from the biophysical system and leads to constraints on capital and only a modest diversity of livelihoods being possible, which in turn potentially feeds back on keeping that sparse population sparse. So that's a sort of system, and I mean, talked at like that, it's very easy to see that as a really sort of negative deficit sort of problem. But really, the message we're trying to get across here is not that it's better or worse than other parts of Australia. It's just different, and those differences potentially create as many opportunities as problems. But one has to think about how one grasps those. And in it really is this core sort of system thing, which I think is actually a thing about a remote system, whether you're, and the question is what causes it to be remote in the first place, which may be the desert environment, but it may also be being in the middle of the Amazon or out in a small island in the middle of the Pacific. And you can start asking what are the sort of things that make this persist, and there are things like service delivery issues, being too expensive to deliver the standard of services that you might expect somewhere else, things like that, which of course comes back to that issue of demand. Issues to do with governance and the poor expression of that demand, the things being driven from outside, issues to do with human capital and so on. And again, it's very easy to see all of that as a very negative sort of picture on it. And over it all, one has to just accept, I think, one of the key insights of this, which is that we can't kid ourselves. The truth is, most people live elsewhere, and it's entirely reasonable and rational and sensible and appropriate for governments and markets and headquarters of companies and so on to actually spend most of their time thinking about places other than this. And so we've got to expect that those organisations will be distant. They will be focused on the way they do things normally in those other places, and they'll be distracted from worrying about the inland Australia most of the time. But opportunities will arrive from time to time, and so the important thing is to shift the mental model from just complaining about this, like complaining about God causing droughts, to actually recognising that you can manage for those, or you can try and make the system resilient to them, and that's really the shift in thinking that you need. And that leads you to thinking about living with and taking advantage of some of these differences. And there are many ways you can think about doing this. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I just want to illustrate that you can make a big long list of them. You can manage with rather than against that variability, and there are plenty of pastoralists who do that really well in relation to climate variability, but you could do it in relation to this too. You can build regional critical mass, some great work going on with business networking and clustering in Australia now, in inland Australia now. You can think about governance arrangements which make this work better. You can think about sustaining local skills and human capital. You can think about all of these things. And you can think about it either in terms of managing them in the desert, so recognising them and saying you can mitigate the impacts of some of these things by doing things better and taking opportunities there. Or you can think about engaging with the outside world, and when those opportunistic events happen where you actually can get significant change to things like governance arrangements, intervening with the right model and making the whole system much more resilient to the fact that people will become disinterested and forget about you or land something on you unexpectedly at some time into the future. And indeed, there are a host, again, I'm not going to go through these, but just to give you a sense that there are many things you can think about where there are fascinating and interesting projects going on. Many of these, by the way, reported in the Rangelands Journal in various publications. And so the question is, how do we pull this together into a systematic approach to living better in these lands? So I want to sort of wrap up just the last 3 or 4 slides with 2 things. One, just talking a bit at the sort of higher level about sustaining all of this resilience, and the other just moving to a level above it again, asking whether there are, asking another profound question I'll come to in just a moment. So the first point is this one. It's just reiterating this issue that any focus on inland Australia is essentially bound to be transient or at least highly variable in its own right. And so the issue is about recognising that this is the reality, managing it where you can internally in desert Australia, and where you can't, or in any case, creating resilience in the system to reduce the impact of that when it does happen. And there are things you can think about. These are documented, I won't talk about them, but you can think about the governance, thinking about devolving governance in an appropriate way, recognising different types of settlement and all the things I've been talking about. You can think about practical things for resources in terms of recurrent funding in the Grants Commission and in terms of future capital funding for rebuilding some of the capitals of Desert Australia, and there are good models around to be thought about there, but a lot more work is needed to create the precise model that can be implemented at an appropriate moment that's politically open to it. Behind it all, though, I just want to raise, this is actually some more recent cogitations of mine, coming actually from visiting the Amazon recently, which I think shares many of these features in a completely different sort of environment. And it's what I'll call it a bit of a profound meta question, and I think it's a real challenge for theory, and it's a bit half-baked still, so forgive me, I'll just put up one slide about it. But it is something that would be interesting to have a talk about. And are there actually alternative stable systems of this overall desert system? Because if you look back in history, essentially you had these sort of historical, relatively isolated, self-sufficient, natural resource-based settlements, the sort of thing around Alice Springs 150 years ago, where there was a market garden there, there was a dairy producing milk and all that sort of thing. There was basically internal economy there, largely because it wasn't very well connected to the world. So it still had impacts from outside, but they were pretty self-sufficient, and that was probably pretty stable, but not any longer because of the changes in connectivity where those services have been sucked out of that region, and there's a huge amount of other things, more conceptual things perhaps, which are fed in by the internet and other things. So today that sort of led to what I'm not sure whether it's a stable state or not, but what I might characterise as I don't mean to be too negative about this because there's lots of good things happening too, but nonetheless, looked at as a whole thing, I think a relatively dysfunctional, remote, low population desert system which is rather disenfranchised by this global connectivity, expectations raised unrealistically, and all sorts of external impacts on the environment there, which people don't have much ability to control at all. So that's sort of a bit what the system looks like today. You can look around the world and see some deserts which are operating in a very different way, and the classic one is the sort of is the major desert settlement, the sort of Phoenix, Arizona, or Abu Dhabi, or Israel perhaps. This is Abu Dhabi, tallest building in the world or something, where there's been at some stage a huge subsidy which has created a large population centre, which perhaps, I don't know whether this is really true, has created a self-sustaining internal economy of some sort. Maybe there's still major subsidy going in, but it's getting towards that anyway. So that's a different model for these sorts of lands, perhaps never likely to happen here in Australia, but maybe it is an alternative, reasonably stable state. But I think the real question for us then is there another stable state? Because this is what we all have vaguely in the back of our minds when we say, I'm sure we can get an Indigenous protected area system across Australia which will really give remote people livelihoods out there, or I'm sure we can make bush foods work, or we can sell Aboriginal art from Yuendamu to New York really effectively. Can you actually do that at a scale which makes the whole system self-sustaining, which actually creates what is still a remote and relatively dispersed population with mines and things like that scattered, and Yulara scattered amongst it, but which is resilient, not because it's being hammered by global connectivity, but because it's using global connectivity, like those people selling from Yuendamu, selling art out of Yuendamu into New York, which is built on the livelihoods which are actually place-based in the sense that they're derived from local natural and cultural resources, which you can't do somewhere else. So it's not a livelihood that can just be taken away and done more efficiently in Sydney, because you can only do it because you can only go and see the McDonnell Ranges in Central Australia. So built on things like that, which is sufficiently respected and understood and supported by other parts of the world, the urban part, to allow it to chart its own destiny despite its remoteness and engage effectively with it. That's an open question. I'll be interested on people's reaction, but I think it would be interesting to explore at this level. And my last point really is that this is an issue of really profound significance for the world. This isn't just something for Desert Australia or even the drylands of the world. This is the pattern of urban population in the 95 countries around the world that have significant chunks of dryland in them. Back in 1950, you can see most of them had no more than 20 or 30% of this is the country that was urbanised, so the whole country, not just the dryland part. So most of them had a relatively small proportion of their population concentrated in urban areas. And so they might at least still have been taking notice of the rural and dryland parts. Today, that's what the distribution looks like. So it's moved to something like a median, more like 50%, which is true for the world as a whole, of course, as you know. We passed 50% urbanised people a couple of years ago. And in 2050, this is the projection. And of course, this is where Australia is today. And so the rest of the world is going to have to face this same issue. It's going to have to face the issue that ultimately these non-urban regions, the rural and remote regions that provide all the ecosystem goods and services and many of the resources that cities need, their governance and resourcing is going to have to be resilient to the reality that in all of these places, at least the ones that have got a vaguely democratic government, that these places are going to focus most of their effort on where most of the people live, which is going to be in the cities. And so the same sort of disjunction of not necessarily understanding the different models that are out there, taking the mental models from the city areas and trying to apply them elsewhere, and possibly stuffing up the functioning of those areas that actually supply the ecosystem goods and services that the city often depends on. That is going to be an issue for really the whole world. It's a really major growing issue, which I don't think we've tackled very well, and we can see the end point of it in a way here in Australia, where that divide is already very big because of the natural way that the country is set up. So I think it's a really significant issue. So in closing, I think in terms of this change in the way that rangelands are conceptualised, pushing us to thinking about this much more multifunctional aspects of these landscapes, it is possible to start thinking anyway. Certainly it's not all completely cleared up and sorted out and finalised. But it is possible to start thinking about how there are common aspects of desert living which flow across all of these different sectors and all of these different sort of policy problems like closing the gap for Aboriginal people, and actually have some underpinning conceptual consistency and potentially some strong theory which would help drive that. And I think understanding those things and understanding how these regions relate to where most people live in cities has profound lessons rather for our changing planet as a whole. So it's an enterprise not to be sniffed at, even if it seems a bit parochial to begin with. And it also perhaps provides a bit of a focus, John, for a sort of basis for some of the theory that ought to flow through the journal in the future. And I'll leave you with a small ad for the book that Julian Cribb and I wrote, really trying to bring some of these issues together. Thanks. And that's the country.
Thank you very much, Mark. Would you have any questions or any comments you'd like to make?
I've got a question about, I guess, marginalisation and I guess with that trend towards urbanisation, as you get sort of more, I guess, heterogeneity within these large centres, there's still issues of marginalisation. And I wonder whether, sometimes homogenous communities might be actually easier to address in terms of services and niche than, yeah, I just wondered if that sort of issue is drawn upon.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's a really good point, and it's an example of how, in fact, the things that potentially cause problems in remote areas also provide actual real opportunities. Yes, the fact that those are more homogeneous, providing you don't go in trying to impose services which are, aimed at an aspiration here, where the homogeneous aspiration in the community is over here, it actually should be a lot easier. Small communities, you have the benefit of being able to know everyone quite easily, to be able to transmit messages through it very easily. You get some pretty intense personal relationships sometimes too, but I mean, this is the whole point. That this is not a negative view on Desert Australia. It's a view that it operates differently to the way we naturally think that larger population centres. Well, in fact, we don't usually naturally think. We just experience and operate in larger population centres. And understanding those differences is really important. So absolutely, I think you're right. And I think, I mean, I could belabor this too much, but I mean, I think in fact, when you're forced to think about some of these issues because of the differences in Desert Australia, you do actually then start to perhaps have some insights which can be carried back to high population areas where they're not critical, but actually they do simmer along under the thing. You look at actually the issue of service delivery to a place like Durras down on the coast here, where half the population is not there, so 2/3 of the population is not there most of the time because they live here in Canberra. They have the same sort of service delivery problems in terms of populations going up and down that Angawala that I mentioned has in a way.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting, and apologies for popping in and out. I've got some chemistry cooking. A couple of points which are tied together in relation to some of the ideas for the future. On one of the slides, you had and I can't remember what you called it, but a fund based on an Alaskan model. I wondered if you could expand on that, and how the carbon farming initiative or carbon in general might be able to help promote some of these newer ideas.
Well, let me just quickly mention the second one first, because I can say that really quickly, which is, I mean, I think there are some real opportunities in that. They need to be not overstated. The challenge of monitoring or verifying, let alone auditing, carbon in landscapes that have very low levels is big. But still, it's another diversification that's a real opportunity out there. The Alaska Permanent Fund is a really interesting model. There's a book by an author whose name I can't remember, but called I can't remember the name of it, called Capitalism 3.0, which is a bit of a harangue about how we set up the rules for capitalism, essentially to say that companies should be there and they should be responsible to their shareholders in very short-term horizons, and that governments are the other major sort of leg to the stool, and we don't have a mechanism out there we don't have many mechanisms for much longer-term views on things, and really it's just operating how we set it up to, apart from the occasional rogue person. And so why would we expect anything to happen other than very short-term views? And so we should be trying to impose a longer-term view. And he argues very strongly that the Alaska Permanent Fund is a good example of this. So it's a fund which the Alaskan legislature set up something like 30 or 40 years ago. If you Google it, you'll get all the details from there. And essentially, what's very important about it is some of the devil that's in the detail, and I won't go into it in detail. But it takes a levy off all of all the sort of mining and so on, all the resources that are taken out of Alaska. But it's owned by all Alaskan people, and it pays a dividend to all Alaskan people every year, as well as a chunk of the majority of the returns from this fund that go into general funding for the state. And so there's a whole lot of actually really interesting issues about the details. The people who set it up were very smart, because it was set up in a way that when, for example, the legislature in a bit of financial trouble 5 years ago wanted to knock off some money out of the fund, they had to go to a plebiscite, and everyone gets some money out of it each year, so they said no. So I mean, it was actually a very resilient structure there. But the last thing I want to say about it is the fund is now built up such that it is returning to the Alaskan economy each year around about twice as much as they would get if they'd taken the amount of cash they'd got each year by just taking that money and putting it straight into the coffers and average that out over the 30 years. About twice as much as that. So in other words, it's returning a lot more to the economy than it would if you just grabbed that money and used it at the time. It's a very interesting model, and you can see more, and you can see other examples of that. He argues that there's a whole stack of our common capitals, of our commons that ought to have similar sorts of arrangements to provide a long-term view instead of the short-term company one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Do you think part of the problem is people's adaptation to those environment or the environment itself? Because places like Yulara, people often get employed for the money, they realise they can't handle the heat and they can't adapt to the place which has been serviced to support that place, and it can often be more serviced than, say, somewhere in rural New South Wales.
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. That's a nice, complicated question. I mean, I think you're right. There's some real complexities that sit under, in a way, at one superficial level, that's articulating how the types of aspirations of people who live in that place may be rather different to, and quite narrow in comparison to larger settlements, and in that particular aspect, the comfort of living in things might be it, and it might be a very inappropriate aspiration for that sort of environment, which I think is what you're getting at. At a broader level, though, it does highlight how I think understanding some of the ways that this system operates allows one to start to think about those sorts of issues differently. And I mean, the thing that I always used to love in Alice Springs was the Centre for Remote Health, for its benefits and failings, but nonetheless it had this wonderful course which was designed to prepare nurses who are going out into remote communities, instead of them turning up on a mail plane, discovering how dreadful it was and going back on the next one. They would it was worth investing the money in spending a month or two really getting people to understand what the system might be like, drop out before they go out there if they don't appreciate those sorts of things. You know, it's a way of creating resilience in the system rather than assuming that you just do the same model that you would for the western suburbs of Sydney, where you just tell the nurse to go and get started. You start to actually create a model that's resilient to the environment that's out there and pick up the sort of thing that you're touching on. Uh-oh.
Mark, just question the notion that in Australia the rangelands are politically marginalised. I believe that's true of the world as a whole. Mm. But in Oz, where I think the default position is that the amount of political representation is proportional to the size of the population. You've obviously got less members per hectare, but you've got approximately the same amount of political representation per person.
Yeah.
And the issue there is I think, as Brian pointed out, the cost of providing services. And I would propose that there's a fair bit more taxpayer expenditure per person in the rangelands than there is in the cities. And that there is actually an argument, not one I support, but there is an argument for actually depopulating the rangelands, because that might be, better from a whole of Australia point of view. And we have to find arguments to counter that if we can see other reasons for keeping the population in the rangelands.
Yeah. Well, again, that opens a complex can of worms, but I mean, two points anyway. Let me throw back at that. One is, there are issues around political marginalisation, but actually I'm mainly meaning policy marginalisation. And I mean that in the sense, and again, you would undoubtedly come back to me and say, I'll bet there's more, policy thinking per person in the range, or certainly Aboriginal persons, than there is per, people in Western Sydney probably. But nonetheless, it's marginalisation in the sense that the mental models a lot of the time that are being applied are ones that come from governing regions that are much more heavily settled. And so there's these mental models that, there are just so many examples. I won't try and list them here. Read my book.
The wrong policies.
Yeah, it's the wrong conceptualisation of how a policy should be implemented, or possibly the wrong policy sometimes. So that's one thing. Just on the straight funding side, I mean, that is also true. It's actually undoubtedly true that the per capita funding of people in Outback Australia is higher than, again, Western Sydney or something. The question is whether that's used effectively. And so, for example, education money to Aboriginal people in the NT goes into the NT considerably higher per capita than you might intend, but actually only about, I think it was 31 cents, was it, in the dollar, actually makes it out onto Aboriginal communities. And that's because of some of these structural issues that I'm talking about. So on the one hand, there might be an intention to invest a lot more, but it doesn't get there. And it's that sort of issue that's behind actually the commentary about the Commonwealth Grants Commission, because the Commonwealth Grants Commission calculates its contribution to these areas based on need, and actually they've got some fantastic thinking in how they do that. But there's absolutely no obligation on the states to show that they ended up spending it in those areas. And the suggestion there from I can't remember the two authors, but anyway, was simply that the amount that's going to different states, because it's targeted at the remoter areas, should be identified, and the states should just be required to report on it. No actual obligation to spend it there, but at least have public reporting on whether they did or not. And I think that would make a big difference.
So Richard, if you could do the last question. I better get it right. That's great.
Ask me about salams.
How do you see the different levels of government, local, state and federal government in these areas helping or hindering the whole development of these changes?
Oh,
Would you like...
Can we have another talk? Well, so I mean, actually, in all seriousness, in that second version of the Rangelands Journal that I put up right at the start, the more recent one last year, which was actually about the dry lands and the Murray-Darling. But in there, we tried to lay out actually the answer to that question. So I'll refer you to that. But I mean, in brief, I think there, at the moment, the centralising tendencies of government act in opposition to a lot of what we're arguing is needed here. And you know, there's a major effort under the rubric of desert governance coming out of Desert Knowledge Australia in Central Australia, really trying to address that. And it's not only an issue for remote Aboriginal communities, and this is part of the point I think about a lot of this, that a lot of the issues for remote areas are remote issues rather than particularly Aboriginal issues. Some of them are genuinely Aboriginal issues too, but a lot of them aren't. It's an issue as much for, say, mining companies in WA struggling with the failure of government to govern the areas that they're trying to do it in. It's as much an issue for some tourism activities as well. So the governance issue is a pretty profound one that sits behind a lot of this. That's evading the details of what you asked, but anyway.
Mark, thank you very much for a great seminar. You've really opened up a whole lot of areas to us, and I, for one, have been thinking again about some of the things, and I particularly like the last challenge there about how is Australia going to think in the future about living out in the Outback. It's clear we haven't got it right yet, and so it's a very important question. So thank you very much for your seminar, and it's been a great start to the Rangeland Journal lecture series. So will you please join me and thank Mark.